As many of you know, I'm a fan of blues music. I don't discriminate when it comes to the various sounds or styles. I love it all. In fact, I believe that blues music is America's cultural gift to the world. And today, I want to talk to you about a time in American music history and blues music history that paved the way for every single blues musician working today. I'm Zach Hval, singer, songwriter, guitar player extraordinaire, and this is the story of how in the 1960s a bunch of college students, out of a desire to become better musicians, stirred up a revival of blues music.
Trouble had it on my day. Trouble had it on my day. Seemed like trouble.
In the 1920s, the record business was in full swing. Like every part of the American economy at the time, it was booming. It was the roaring 20s, and for the first time, people had extra money in their pockets and they were willing to spend it. The first music clubs started open. Record companies couldn't get records out fast enough. It was the time of jazz, and boogie-woogie piano, and dancing to Charleston. But far away from the hustle and bustle of the big cities like Chicago or New York, in the southern United States, down in the Mississippi Delta, something incredible was happening. Artists like Robert Johnson, Son House, Brownie McGhee, and one of my personal favorites, Mississippi John Hurt, were making their first recordings. A lot of these guys just played for the fun of it at dance halls or on their front porch after a long day of chopping cotton. They never considered a future in music or pursuing music as a career. These songs were about their lives, the world that they lived in, and the pain and suffering that came with the Jim Crow era. For a lot of these artists, the 45 RPM singles didn't sell well and never really captured mainstream audiences, and the ones that did sell well were sold exclusively to black audiences in the South. Unfortunately, in 1928, the record industry, like most industries, crashed at the onset of the Great Depression. That meant that many of the records and the artists that played on them of the Mississippi Delta would be lost to time. That is, until something truly remarkable happened and began to take shape in the 1950s and 1960s. By the 50s, many of the artists I mentioned were forgotten. Even pioneers of the electric blues like Muddy Waters or B.B. King were often overlooked throughout the 40s and 50s. This is likely because the records that they were making were marketed almost exclusively to black audiences, which even back then was a reasonable sized audience, but still very limited. Like any revival, it's hard to say exactly where or when it began. The common source is in New York City's Greenwich Village and Washington Square. Some argue that the great folk and blues music revival began in San Francisco in the 50s and then made its way to New York City. Dave Van Ronk makes that very argument in his memoir, The Mayor of MacDougal Street. In any case, young, white, predominantly men began to take an interest in blues music. Many of them were budding musicians themselves. Slowly but surely, they began to collect records, 45s and 78s of guys like Josh White, Leadbelly, and Sonny Terry. These young musicians would sometime later be dubbed by music critics and music historians as Folkies. They worshipped the authenticity of this music, its rawness, its honesty, its purity. They began to attempt to learn and transcribe these songs by ear. Keep in mind that this is the pre-internet days. They didn't have access to hours of blues music instruction at their fingertips like we do today. They had to put in blood, sweat, and according to many of their personal accounts, even some tears. Eventually, though, some of them realized that a lot of these musicians, their heroes, were alive even by the mid-1960s, and they began to seek out these musical icons to connect with them, to see if they could get guitar lessons, to see if these guys would pass on their knowledge. As far as big-name folkies go, we all know of Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, and Tom Paxton, but I want to focus on some people that maybe aren't known to the mainstream. A favorite story of mine is from Stephen Grossman, whose big hero was Reverend Gary Davis. In an interview with Acoustic Guitar magazine, Stephen Grossman recalled, "I had a friend, Bob Fox, who had been going up to see Reverend Gary Davis up in the Bronx. He said, well, here's his phone number, give him a call. And so I rang, and Reverend Davis said, "Come on up. Bring your money, honey." That meant $5 a lesson. My parents drove me there the first time, ostensibly because my father needed to buy a pair of shoes in the Bronx. But it was all a fabrication because where Reverend Gary Davis lived, it was considered one of the most dangerous blocks in America. He had a little shack behind these derelict apartment buildings that looked like Dresden, Germany, after the firebombing in World War II. Reverend Davis opened the door without his sunglasses on. He had one bulbous eye and the other was all white, and it just sucked me in. It was such a fantastic atmosphere, and he was just amazing. And that was the beginning of 2 or 3 years of solid lessons. Reverend Davis had just done a record for Prestige, Harlem Street Singer, and he taught me the album song by song. Each lesson was as long as you wanted it to be. I would stay up there for hours and hours. Eventually, I had realized the enormity of his repertoire and started bringing a tape machine to document what he was playing, not just so I could later hear all of the tunes I wanted to learn, but to help Reverend Gary Davis publish and copyright his works. When asked about the dynamic between these kids and their heroes, Grossman said, "All the musicians were very open and helpful in showing us how they played guitar, telling stories and answering the many questions that we had about the blues scene in the 20s and before. I started to transcribe from the old records, and when I would meet someone like John Hurt, I would say, 'Hey, John, is this the way you played it?' And he was just so chuffed to see this kid who could play exactly like how he used to. It bridged the big gap between an elderly black man from the South and a Jewish teenager from Brooklyn. The one thing that no one bothered to ask the musicians, these guys from Jim Crow, Mississippi, and all that crap that came with it, was how they felt. Can you imagine how weird it must have been to all of a sudden be playing at the Newport Folk Festival to thousands of very young and appreciative white faces? But the musicians were completely supportive. More than supportive, they just felt good about it, and we did too. It was a real exchange of information. Another good story of one of these kids is from a personal musical hero of mine, folk singer Dave Van Ronk. The clip I'm about to play is from a 1997 performance at the Barns at Wolf Trap. Dave's full performance of Spike Driver Blues by Mississippi John Hurt can be found in this description below.
Or that happens to me that is apparently unusual, although not totally unheard of. It's a thing psychologists refer to as lucid dreaming. And this is a kind of dream that people have where the details and everything are so sharp and so clearly realized that it's almost impossible to tell the difference between your dream and actual experience. Well, I first heard Mississippi John Hurt on the Folkways anthology, and immediately set to work to learn. He had 2 tunes on it. Set to work to learn those 2 tunes, and he was God. That was simple, there's God. And later on, I heard more of his old recordings and so on. I never heard anything to make me doubt that was God. And I assumed, I suppose I have some Nietzsche in me or something like that, that he was dead. So we cut to 1963, and I was in Boston, and I was sitting in a little coffee house called the Cafe Yada. It was over near Fenway Park. And I'm sitting in the coffee house, and there, on stage, with a guitar in his hand, was God. He was alive. Had been alive all this while. A fellow by the name of Tom Hoskins went down to Mississippi, found him, and brought him up. Yes. So here's for Tom. And I'm sitting there, and I'm thinking, this has to be one of those lucid dreams. And then I decided, no, it couldn't be, because it was too far-fetched. And, well, I met John that night, and subsequently we became good friends. I had a chance to sit at God's feet. I learned this.
Harry Smith's Anthology of American Folk Music is probably one of the most important pieces of recorded music in history, and I couldn't make this video or record this section without mentioning it. It deserves a video of its own. The bluesmen of the Delta weren't the only ones who were seeing newfound fame. Even artists that never really disappeared were getting the attention they rightly deserved thanks to these aspiring young musicians. I think of Muddy Waters, who throughout the late 1940s and 50s did reasonably well for himself on the Chess record label, at least commercially, and again specifically with black audiences. But he too saw an increase in wide appreciation and fandom for his music. He was even one of the heroes of Mike Bloomfield, who we've talked about on this channel. In fact, Muddy was a big influence on the Paul Butterfield Blues Band, with which Michael Bloomfield played guitar. This revival of blues music wasn't limited to the States. The Rolling Stones coined their name based off a Muddy Waters song from the 1950s. Of course, there is John Mayall and the Blues Breakers. John Mayall is considered the godfather of British blues. I mean, if you want to hear the British blues sound summed up in a single record, look no further than the 1966 album Blues Breakers with Eric Clapton, also famously referred to as the Beano album due to the magazine that Eric Clapton is holding on the cover of the album. The performance of Freddie King's song Hideaway shows that these men not only appreciated the music, but really understood how to play it and where it came from. Not to mention that Clapton's use of a Gibson Les Paul through an early Marshall amplifier would go on to inspire a whole new sound and style of guitar playing. It also helps that at the time in Europe, an American guitarist who was relatively unknown at the time, named Jimi Hendrix, began performing overseas. He was also a fan of the bluesmen of the 1940s and 50s. Circling back to the U.S. electric blues sound, artists like Johnny Winter would come up and later go on to become one of the most acclaimed slide guitar players of all time. The more artists that came up inspired by the bluesmen of the Mississippi Delta and Chicago, the greater the demand came for more blues music. It was from this demand that guys like B.B. King, Albert King, and John Lee Hooker were able to achieve a wider audience. Basically, what you see happening in the 1960s is the initial influence of black artists impacting young, white, upcoming artists. These young artists would then cite the black artists as heroes, leading to people listening to their records. You also see musicians in England taking notice of what's happening over in America and getting inspired by it, also citing these same black artists, with overseas audiences now buying those records. The British artists would inspire more American groups and musicians, and the cycle repeats until you have the birth of a new movement, a new sound, a new way of looking at and appreciating the music of the past. This was the music that served as the foundation for the British invasion, as well as the explosion of the rock music of the 1960s, or as we call it today, classic rock. To recap, we have numerous musicians in the American South and Midwest quietly recording songs. Some would not sell very well, either due to a lack of interest or being marketed exclusively to black audiences, which again is only a fraction of the total available audience. Aspiring guitar players, harmonica players, songwriters, and other bohemians of the 50s and 60s began to take an interest in this music. In its rawness, its emotion, its universal feeling of being sad or going through hard times. They began to seek out the surviving bluesmen and learn how to play this music by the men and women who largely created it. They brought it to white audiences, and some in this audience would also seek out these old recordings. Inspired by the electric blues sound of Chicago, guitarists like Mike Bloomfield and the Paul Butterfield Blues Band would begin to make names for themselves, shining a light on Muddy Waters, John Lee Hooker, and B.B. King. Then musicians across the pond like Eric Clapton would also develop an interest in American blues music and go on to inspire other groups of players. The sound of the British blues would make its way back to the United States and inspire more artists. To me, it's inspiring and amazing to see that some nerds in college, out of desperation to some degree and curiosity, would seek out elder statesmen of the blues. It is because of this revival we have men like Stephen Grossman, who founded his guitar workshop, which has become an indispensable resource in learning acoustic blues guitar. In fact, his DVDs and books have helped me discover how to play this music like the bluesmen of the old. Of course, I too spent hours trying to transcribe some of these songs by ear. This revival would also go on to reap future rewards. His guitarists like Stevie Ray Vaughan, Eddie Van Halen, and Joe Satriani were all inspired by the music that came out of this revival, or at least the guitarists that came up during this time. This revival led to the copywriting and publishing of many Delta blues legends whose work would have been left without this protection. Not to mention the archiving done by the Smithsonian Folkways, Alan Lomax, Moses Ashe, and his recordings. It is due to this revival and the efforts of the men and women who lived through it that we can go back to the 1920s and experience the music in its purest form. We can then watch it change and mold as each new generation learns the blues and puts their own spin on it. Now, critics of the revival claim cultural appropriation, that white people stole this music from black people and popularized it. To me, this ignores the kind words and appreciation that these black artists had for the white artists, and to my knowledge, all of them encouraged the white artists in their pursuits and in these efforts. And we have seen that many even taught these artists. This argument also misses the fundamental part of the blues experience. To quote a line from many, many, many blues songs, "The blues ain't nothing but a good man feeling bad." And what makes blues music so appealing is its universality. We all go through hard times. Now, it may not be as painful as Jim Crow segregation or the generational trauma of slavery or what happened during the Holocaust, but the experience of trials and difficulty is a constant across cultures and backgrounds. It's almost as if no culture is a monolith. No one owns the blues. It's a universal feeling that we all experience several times throughout our lifetime. What these men and women from the Delta and what the college kids did during the 1960s was channel that feeling into art. After all, isn't one of the main purposes of art to make people feel something? And the blues, as an art form and as a music style, is all about feeling. A feeling that crosses racial and even generational divides. And that is the story of the blues revival of the 1960s, at least in the shortest, most digestible way possible I could think to present it to you. There are countless hours of reading, there's documentaries you can watch, and you can just listen to the records yourself and listen to the, these folk singers and guys like that talk about these musicians to learn about it. This video really, honestly, barely scratches the surface. Like I said, there's hours of information out there that you can pour through. I certainly did. That's where all of the information in this video came from. It's just my own brain archives, plus a little bit of research. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to watch this video. It really does mean the most. I hope that it piques your interest if you're curious about blues, whether you're kind of new to blues music or you're a longtime fan, such as myself. I hope that you found this entertaining and educational. Of course, I do want to remind you that there are links to everything in the description box below. You'll find my Instagram, Facebook, and things like that. You'll also find links to Spotify for my latest album. Of course, I'm on iTunes, Amazon, everywhere else. If you're interested in hearing, the music that was, my own music that was inspired by this music, that would mean the most to me as well. I would also appreciate it if you would consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more videos like that. As an added perk of subscribing, you also get to hang out with us every Tuesday night for Musical Hangout, the live music experience that I was trying to get my pastor to watch just last Sunday. Every Tuesday night at 6 p.m. Musical Hangout. Would appreciate it if you would stick around for that. I think that's everything. So I just want to say thank you so much for watching. I'm Zach Hval, singer, songwriter, guitar player extraordinaire, signing off, reminding you that the best aphrodisiac is still a naked woman. Bread is bread, cheese is cheese, praise God.
Hallelujah.
Hallelujah.